Terrific. Well, thanks again, everybody, for spending a few minutes with us to look at what can only be described as chargeback hell if you've ever had an issue with chargebacks, although chargebacks are only one symptom of fraud and other issues that we have. So let me just open up quickly with who's count, but we've got about 15 years experience working in e-com online businesses. We were actually a merchant before we broke off this segment of our business. We know what merchants go through. We see their pains every day. We've got several patented and core technology, not only patented, but trade secrets. We'll go through some of those a little bit later. We safeguard some of the world's largest merchants, payments providers, gateways, e-commerce platforms, shopping cart platforms, and so forth. And our motto, and what we do, is boost sales and beat fraud. This is really our mission. This is what I think everybody, at least in the card not present space, hopes for. Increased in sales, lowered risk, and that would be a fantastic message for everybody. You know, as we go around the world, we get to talk with hundreds of different merchants, and this is a phrase that I hear all the time: I don't have a fraud problem. And that could very well be true. But more often than not, there's oftentimes symptoms of fraud that don't reveal themselves very easily. The reason chargebacks are so symptomatic of fraud is because everybody understands them. They know what a chargeback is. It's a bad thing. Nobody wants them. And more than half of chargebacks are caused by fraudulent behavior, according to Visa. Right now, we're seeing a huge increase. We'll get to some of the reasons why. But if you're trying to go with your fingers crossed and hope you don't ever have a fraud problem, that's just not a good strategy. Folks either have been hit by fraud or they will be hit by fraud, and some of the evidence we have will show that. Fraud hurts businesses, but it all boils down to most merchants are just not fraud experts. And when we come across folks that have put things in place, oftentimes they're very blunt instruments. And yes, they may slow fraud down, but it's at the expense of sales. It's at the expense of customer satisfaction or brand recognition and so forth. Depending on your type of business, a chargeback rate above 50 basis points is a symptom that we would probably want to look at. Now that varies. If you're selling laptops, that's probably too high a chargeback rate for you. If you're selling 99-cent apps, you're probably perfectly fine with a 0.5% chargebacks, maximizing your sales. And we'll show how some of that works in different business organizations as we go. Let's talk about what's happening recently. All this has been in the news. There's several others in the last few years that we could talk about, but when you look at what's happening with POS breaches, how does that hurt my online business? Well, there's 100 million at least that we know of. There could be more. Valid credit cards, the information behind them, debit cards with pins and so forth. We've seen behind the scenes, what most people don't see, is the cyber criminal networks are starting to expand. They buy that information so that they can sell it and turn it into cash as quickly as possible. It's great that we see a huge tick up in sales, but oftentimes that what we call the holiday hangover is just hidden fraud issues that become revealed. And they become revealed in a very nasty way to most merchants. Because chargebacks have a delayed system where you don't see them immediately, you see them at a minimum of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days out, it's hard to see where the problem was as it's happening. So you'll see that a merchant, I've done some numbers here, and these are numbers representative of what may happen. I'll show you some actual numbers from one of our clients here in just a moment. But you see that as transaction goes up, the chargeback doesn't hit at the same time. And so through the holidays, we see great sales, our chargebacks are in line, and then as soon as things start to turn to normal following that December rush, sometimes even into January with gift cards and so forth, sales come back down to normal, and yet now the chargebacks come in are recorded on those days instead of the days where they actually happen. And there's a misalignment. That misalignment can be pretty detrimental. And as I'll show you here, it can happen and go on for 2, 3, 4, we've even seen it happen for 6 months as those chargebacks come in that are following up from the big lift in the holiday season. This is what we really want to do. To avoid the holiday hangover, we want to push that fraud level down as much as we can so that there's no surprise come into the first part of the year. Let's go through a case study. This is Reed's Jewelers. They're in 25 states around the country here. They are a pretty well-known brick and mortar company in those states, and they went online a few years back. They started to see some issues. By early 2012, the order rejection rate became very, very high. Now, as you might imagine, this is a luxury item, pretty high ticket item. Manual reviews was the way they started to do their fraud mitigation. And oftentimes they would call the person that put the order in and say, hey, tell your bank that it's okay for this order to go through, and you can imagine what type of conversion rate that had. It was pretty poor. Then they got hit by even a bigger spike in fraud. And the current management techniques, like I said, manual review, they just didn't scale. And they started to say, what is my strategy going forward? Obviously, this is an area we want to increase our sales, but we can't have the risk exposure that we've had to date. They chose Count after looking over a review, implemented in a couple of weeks, and launched with core technology plus some specific things we did for them as they launched this. The results were 80% fewer bad transactions, 85% less time on manual reviews. These, I think, are probably the most important things. Yes, they reduced their fraud, but a 24% boost in sales in that 14 months. 2,300 additional orders that they looked at and said, we would have rejected these orders last year. This year we've accepted them. They're adding to their bottom line, and they've seen an 8 to 9% improvement in their online store bottom line. Something that's very difficult to put a price tag on is their increased customer satisfaction. They've got a brand, it was a service-oriented brand, and yet online that service-oriented brand was insulting customers, which had a detrimental effect in their bottom line as they went forward. An all-in-one fraud strategy is really what we're looking for, something that detects and screens for fraud. My strategy is managed as a business. What are my tolerance for risks? What are the things that I want to do? And then the operational management. How do I handle the case management? How do I handle interacting with my logistics systems, my accounting system, and so forth? I'm going to use Count's fraud system here for a minute. I want to show you some examples. This is what happens when an order comes from a consumer into a client. It goes through our real-time analytics engine over here that looks at literally hundreds of pieces of data in fractions of a second, puts a score in place, adds the rules that a customer wants, and then in about 300 milliseconds sends a resolution to the merchant saying, we believe this is a good transaction or a bad transaction. It literally happens faster than the blink of an eye. I want to talk about some specific technology that is very key when it comes to reducing chargebacks. And we talked about the data breach. We've talked about fraud screening. Some of those things take place, and there's lots of great technologies like our multi-layer device fingerprinting, our proxy piercing, the mobile device. Are they using a mobile device or not? Some of those technologies are fantastic in an interlocking platform that can use several technologies to give you better insight of what's happening in your particular organization. One of those technologies we're going to talk about looks at sophisticated fraud. When you talk about fraud today, it's becoming much more sophisticated than it ever has been. It's much more organized than it ever has been. When you start talking about what's happening around the world, it's no longer just a single hacker, or very seldom is a single hacker. They're very well networked. When you look at how fraud pinpoints throughout the world and where it originates and where it happens, it's very well networked across the globe. Let me give you just an example of how that works. Let's take this merchant linking or order linking technology that's part of the analytics that Count uses. So somebody comes to your site and they are making a transaction, whether it's a payment, they're filling out an application, they want to do a free download, whatever that transaction of information is. And for simplicity's sake here, I'm going to say we're going to look at the device, the credit card, and the email. And For all intents and purposes, this looks like a completely legitimate transaction, which a card being stolen in the database breaches that we've seen would look completely legitimate because they've got all the right information. The card, the security code, the name, date, address, the PIN, and so forth. So this makes those transactions look completely valid. But when we look at linking technology, we notice that this card was linked to another device, which was linked to other emails, which was linked to other devices and credit cards, and you get the picture. This goes on to the nth degree. Linking technology is important, but if it only links one or two things together, it's not very effective. We actually link on hundreds of pieces of data, and we link it out till the link stops. It could go on 25 different levels until the linking stops. And what that does for us is it gives us a picture. It says this particular transaction may be related to 8 different credit cards, 9 devices, and 10 different emails. Now, in a normal situation, that is not probably a legitimate transaction. That linking there links folks to all kinds of other bad behavior that we've seen. This linking technology would be almost impossible for most merchants to participate in just because of the server power, the technology behind it, the patents, the proprietary trade secrets, and so forth. Linking technology is one of the most significant advances in the last decade when it comes to fraud mitigation. Now, that technology also will help you determine good customers from bad customers. Add that to the rest of what you see in this particular fraud system, and it's one piece of the puzzle that really will give merchants that assurity that what they're doing is good, what they've seen is correct, and they can make a decision whether they're going to accept that risk or not. And it's a very sophisticated piece of that technology. Now I want to take another minute and look at another piece of technology that people use, and that's manual transaction review. Recent surveys have said 75 to 90% of manual transactions are eventually approved. And yet we will spend somewhere in the neighborhood, I've seen it as low as $4 and as high as $22 per manual review, depending on your system, depending on how you set things up. It's the single most costly tactic for reducing fraud. It's very difficult to scale. The consistency and human error that is involved in this continues to reduce valid transactions. And like I said earlier, a recent survey came out that said 24 to 27% of transactions are manually reviewed. Now, we asked some questions when you registered for this webinar about what's your manual review rate, what's your chargeback rate, are you in an excessive chargeback program? If you don't know what those rates are, it might be something that you'd want to put together. We'd be happy to help you. We've got an ROI system that we use here at Count that shows where do you stack up and how well you're doing against the norm in your industry. What we've seen is if a proper fraud system is put in place, let's start with this top line here where we're talking about shippable goods. We can screen about 90 to 95% of transactions in that 300 to 350 milliseconds. Then, if there's still a question and we need further review, we move over to the auto agent. And the auto agent will take another 5 to 7% and resolve those. And what the auto agent does is it automates things that a manual review agent would have to do. They might look up LexisNexis. They might pull something off of Targus or 192.com. They may have other databases of information that they want to pull from to try and satisfy whatever it is we saw that was deficient in the original transaction, to satisfy a rule that triggered, or to make them more comfortable with the transaction itself. Then, the very last thing that we want to do is perform a manual transaction, or excuse me, a manual review of that transaction. Most of the time, we can reduce that down to less than 3 to 5%. And that's typically in your shippable goods type market. If you're in a digital goods market, and we'll show one of those case studies here in just a second, they don't want to do manual review. They want to eliminate that. They want that to be something that they never have to do. So they have to fine-tune things a little bit tighter. They want their front-end screening and their automated system to handle 100% of what they see. 90% of fraud happens in the first 24 hours. You've really got to see what's happening now, today, at this instant. Linking technology, some of the other technologies we talked about, all occurring in that sub-second response time to really give you what's happening in the world today to see if that is a good or bad transaction. Several interlocking technologies, the way we put them together at Count is we develop them all. They're all our technologies. We patented them, we protected them, which gives us the speed and accuracy that you need in today's world. When you see links of hundreds of thousands of criminal networks out there or criminal activity pieces and elements out there, you've really got to have those interlocking technologies to be able to detect them in a timely manner and reduce those or eliminate those manual reviews in the system today. I appreciate your time today. I hope this has been helpful. I hope this has given you some information on how you can reduce chargebacks and actually increase sales along